to introduce कर दे topic को.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi guys, how's it going? We apologize for the small break we took. I was actually outside of Delhi for some work. I was in Calcutta for a week, and we weren't able to record in that span. And there was always the festive season in between, so we got very busy with that. And to start off, Happy Diwali. And today's episode will be covering the recent arrests of Pavel Durov, who is the founder of Telegram, a message based application, and his arrest and its wider implications as to where the government oriented tech policies of various countries is standing in the present times, and whether people who are master innovators of technology, of life changing technology, how much control do they have in policy making and in different power structures? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are good examples. So, Raj, why don't you take over?
Yeah, I think Pavel Durov is also in the category of sort of outspoken billionaires,
Mhm.
and he has a very passionate view on things like end-to-end encryption and data privacy and things of those sorts. So he's not typically a guy who will comply with government requests to break encryptions or provide a backdoor view into a messaging platform. So he's not a person who will be outwardly cooperative when you speak about things like tech regulation.
Yeah.
The problem that will cause is that countries like Russia, which is where he's a native of, are actually sort of, uh, for the lack of a better word, they have strong governments. So, to put it politely, and strong governments or even governments with a sort of authoritarian tinge are sort of very big on concepts like data localization, and they like to using arguments like national security. They would prefer keeping a tight leash on data. They would at the very least prefer that tech companies and social media data fiduciaries have a framework to provide a backdoor entry to sort of break the encryption. They will also not uh, shy away from holding social media companies accountable for the content that is being circulated on a particular platform, although it is subject to a very reasonable debate whether the liability of whether or not the liability of some kind of illegal or some kind of inappropriate content floating on a social media platform, should it fall on the platform itself or should it fall on the user? So can a tech company be really faulted for trying to protect data privacy? And if, for example, some kind of misuse is being done of a particular social media or a tech platform, then who should bear the legal burden? And these things are sort of under regulated, which is why I found this conversation a little interesting. It might be over regulated, under regulated, but the the core issue is that the legal and the policy framework is not clear. And as a result, I think that this discussion was sort of interesting. There might be many kinds of content which can be considered problematic. Passing of information to quote unquote banned organizations, uh, various types of disturbing pornography, they can all be circulated on platforms which have a very, very strong degree of encryption. So, can you really blame the governments for having a sort of a view that seeks to break these encryptions? I personally don't think so. But beyond that, I think there are many more underlying questions about tech policy regulation that need to be answered before we take this debate forward. Jay, let's get your thoughts since you're a lawyer also.
Uh, I'm not going to go into the legal aspects of it, but I feel it's high time that there is some regulatory check that is imposed, specifically in the context of India, which is facing so many security threats in its neighborhood. And It is a double edged sword, because I feel the governments involved also try to arm twist a lot of tech companies so that they can get information out which they think is suspicious.
Mm.
But at the same time, where do you draw a line as to what can be considered suspicious and what can't be? Because a lot of times such databases are misused to ensure that the political opponents of certain ruling elites in those specific countries are also harassed. So that's where I feel that there needs to be a line that is drawn. Now I will talk about the kind of power that can be wielded by such companies, because they have so much information, because they have so much sensitive information. There'd be a time where they can literally show the middle finger to the parties associated and say that we're not going to give you this information. And that would basically mean that they have certain levels of autonomy and certain levels of nuisance power, where they can put such government, such powerful institutions on the negotiating table. So I feel we're heading towards a time where such technological moguls are essentially coming at the level of the government or governments.
They're equally powerful, if
Yeah.
not more. So,
Mhm.
interestingly, what becomes important when we start speaking about a regulatory framework is that it is not easy to mediate and resolve disputes between private companies,
Mhm.
large big tech firms, and sovereign institutions.
Absolutely.
So, where you mediate between a sovereign and large sort of big data fiduciaries is also required to be answered first by any any kind of maybe a parliament or a government run think tank that is working on some kind of tech regulation. So one of the first questions that you deal with is how do you come up with a good dispute resolution mechanism for a sovereign institution and an international sort of private data
Private company.
fiduciary.
So, sorry.
No, 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 please.
So, like, before operating in different countries, there are different compliances, regulatory compliances that they have to go through. And with respect to contracts that they sign, it's mostly either with the private enterprises within that country or with government institutions. And in both the cases, the contracts that are signed, they have like an arbitration clause. And that arbitration clause mentions the seat of arbitration being a place which is neutral. Usually people go for Singapore because Singapore is considered to be like the seat of arbitration. And in that process, in the whole mediation process, say with respect to certain losses or certain contract obligations not being met by the parties, a lot of discussions take place. So that is the general SOP of how mediation works with such institutions.
Right. I think that could, I think, become a little bit more complicated as a process
Yeah,
when you start speaking of tech companies because India is big on the attempt to ensure data localization.
yeah,
That, in simple terms, we call for data to be stored and, it's the data to be stored and shared locally and those sorts of things. So you can even have a stronger hold on the legal frameworks that deal
yeah.
with uh, taking punitive action if required against people spreading a certain kind of content, for example. But when you have these large private data fiduciaries who have their data storage being done in maybe Northern California, maybe the headquarter is somewhere in Europe, and then they have a large office in India, then hypothetically, if some quote unquote misinformation is spread, and which can lead to maybe a communal flare up in a small part of Bihar, for example, then how do you find a framework to hold the data fiduciary liable?
Absolutely. I mean, to
So I'll just finish up.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't want to cut you off. You can
yeah,
finish after this. So the now the government of India stance is that they will start putting criminal liability on the. I'll check maybe if I'm being factually correct here, but from what I understand, this was sort of a wielded threat that the government of India gave social media platforms was that they will start holding them liable for the misinformation that's being spread on these platforms. So the important question that comes out is that, is this an effective way of sort of platform governance?
I think for a very long time you had these social media applications and platforms giving out information where there were warnings and there were a lot of other disclaimers and cautionary windows attached to various sources of information, like videos and pictures, where the algorithm of those applications thought that this could be fake. But the thing is that a lot of times the effort that's being put by these social media applications and platforms is too little too late. And to corroborate my proposition, I'm going to give you the example of the violence that flared up in Manipur when the tensions between Cookies and Maitis raised, and the massive protests that took place in places like Lamka. uh, a video was circulated amongst the Meiteis, which was actually from Delhi, and it said that a Meitei woman was raped by the cookies, and in that is the flare up of, like, first instances of mass violence, and after that it just like snowballed into something which couldn't be controlled. And later it was found out that video had nothing to do with Manipur; it was from North India. So
Yeah, I
it
think
was too little too late. And into
absolutely.
2023, so we remember, right, we had warnings and, like, imagery which said ki this could be fake, this belongs to this particular government, this piece of information is being spread by the Qatari government. So with Al Jazeera also, they mentioned ki it's funded by the Qatar government, so it will have a certain bias. So
Yeah.
that is something which is mentioned in different applications, but sometimes it's too little too late, because in certain situations people are just looking for a reason for a
Yeah.
flare up.
I think very, very important point here that we have a direct example of how um maybe the under regulation or the inability to regulate and content moderate on certain areas of social media can cause a direct threat to internal security.
Mm-hmm.
In the example of the flare ups in Manipur onwards of 2023, right?
Yeah.
And what's happened post is that social media has repetitively been used more and more for disinformation. Even now there's still very little that people have been able to do in terms of regulating and preventing these flare-ups from happening again. So and even prior to Manipur there were calls of regulating platforms. India is a country which is very, very strongly on board for concepts like data localization, content moderation, and even a slight breaking of the end-to-end encryption facility, for example, because there is a certain degree of ease it can provide law enforcement and other sovereign institutions, which by all means should every sovereign country, democratic country has its own rights to sort of administer these tech platforms, right? So that's one area where I will sort of defend the approach by the government of India or maybe the Ministry of Home Affairs to regulate tech policy and tech platforms to sort of break this encryption, to have this overwatch mechanism. Those areas I understand the view of the Ministry of Home Affairs and other institutions of the government of India. But to backtrack on that, some of these applications have come up with a certain kind of tech activism to them. I think in countries uh, in Europe and from even areas where maybe Telegram is popularly used, certain governments have a tendency to ask a lot of information about their opposition leaders. Certain governments have a tendency to extract a lot of information about activists and NGOs who might be very critical of the government. So, can you really fault tech policy platforms of being wary of providing all the information to sovereign institutions when their attempts may be power hungry? So, as a result, I think maybe a neutral judicial overwatch with certain kind of maybe like a quasi judicial tech policy framework
There was a
to
committee
resolve disputes could be
that
a
sat
prudent
down.
one. Sorry.
There
Yeah.
was a committee that sat down with respect to data policy and
In India?
privacy. Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
And I'm not talking about the Puttaswamy judgment, which basically
right,
talked about right to privacy. There was
right.
another committee that sat down. It was a judicial overwatch to
Mhm.
precisely what we are talking about right now. We will put the link to the articles with respect to that committee. I can't remember it right now. Should I Google it?
Yeah, please do. Let's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my suggestion is that you can have a framework to resolve
Mhm.
disputes with that have sovereign institutions and data uh, fiduciaries on two different sides of it
Yeah.
with a certain
Shri
kind of
Krishna Committee,
right.
2017.
Right. With a certain
Shri
kind of
Krishna
maybe
Committee.
judicial overwatch,
Yeah.
have some technical members on it, have some retired judges on it. So you can have like
Exactly. It
a
was chaired by the retired Supreme Court Judge Justice B.N. Sri Krishna and included members from the government. It's exactly what we talked about.
okay.
So it basically aims to establish a data protection authority, processing practices which are founded on consent, and proposing that the government not be exempted from data protection regime unless it's authorized by the parliament.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, the government of India also released a new bill, the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill, 2022, instead of using the
Yeah.
Shri Krishna Committee's
Yeah.
draft.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
these. I did read the
Mm-hmm.
summaries of the digital
Mm-hmm.
uh, data protection bill of 2022,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of platform and tech regulation in India is a lot of it is still like self regulation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the assessment is that maybe the platforms will have a liaison with the government
Mm-hmm.
and they will provide the required information and they will have a self regulatory kind of approach,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a point beyond which it stops being practical because and I think you see that a little bit with the OTT regulation and maybe even regulation of digital content creators and educational content
Mm-hmm.
on YouTube and those kind of things also, that beyond a point you can't expect content creators to be content moderators also. So there's going to be a requirement to deploy the quote unquote governance and judicial tools, but also deploy certain things like maybe artificial intelligence to pick up on areas which are violative of certain guidelines and maybe forward them to a kind of a regulatory authority. I'm just loud thinking. It's might
Mm-hmm.
not be the perfect solution,
There
but
is
I guess there is
yeah.
no perfect solution to this right now.
Yeah, there is a massive debate as to how OTT platforms should also be regulated
Uh,
because, again, OTT platforms are also mostly controlled by big tech.
yeah.
And in India, there is also the influence of Ambani's.
Yes.
And given that Amazon is basically run by Jeff Bezos, there's a lot of accusation of against Jeff Bezos for shoving down a lot of agenda driven
Mm.
politics and ideas through their OTT platforms. This is the accusation a lot of people from the government also throw against
Yeah.
Amazon, and it's their way or and Netflix. It's their way of showing that this is a new normal, and that can actually come into
Mm.
conflict with the countries which have a lot of conservative values, or governments which are running countries on the basis of conservative principles, and so
Right.
that can also be a point of contention.
Mm.
And that's where I feel that they're pushing in through the OTT regulations, where they can put in some checks and balances from their perspective. I personally feel that there shouldn't be any restrictions on OTT, in my opinion, because I
Yeah.
think there should be some platform where people can say whatever, do whatever, and of course it should not be offending any community, but it should be free.
But that's a
Yeah,
that's a contradictory view in itself, right?
yeah. Of course,
That
of
if
course.
I can
Yeah,
say that
yeah.
we
Exactly.
should have
Then.
platforms
Mm,
where you can say whatever and do
yeah.
whatever, that it's only a matter of time that somebody on that platform will step up and say that all the people from this religion
Mm,
are this,
mm,
something deeply offensive, you might say.
mm.
It's just a matter of time. you
Absolutely.
you cannot have a public square in the digital space kind of attitude that Elon Musk
Absolutely.
advocates. With all due respect,
Yeah.
I kind of understand his view also,
Mm-hmm.
but beyond a point, if you
Mm.
under-regulate these social
Yeah.
media platforms, it will become a hotbed for spreading
Absolutely.
misinformation after a point. there definitely should be some resistance to censorship.
Uh-huh.
So I think that the key is to find the right balance between censorship,
Yeah,
yet allowing a certain kind of responsible free speech.
absolutely.
So
Nee, I,
I kind of get the view
what I'm trying to say is
of.
that again, it's a double-edged sword because there are a lot of things a lot of people find offensive, and sometimes the things which are said can lead to violence, and it has happened a lot of times because certain communities react to certain things in a way different manner, and our main goal is to avoid all types of violence.
Yeah,
Like, I'm not saying ki you just become like France.
yeah.
I feel France's approach was a bit too
Bit on the
triggering.
extreme side.
Yeah, but I'm also saying ki then there should not be a position like, if you're providing a platform for free speech, then it should be free for all. Then it should not be ki you're just pandering to one ideology because that ideology has more propensity towards violence, right? So you're just not saying anything to piss off those people.
Yeah, I
But
think.
for one ideology which does not indulge in that type of violence, you're like, going absolutely bonkers
Yeah, I
with
think
whatever criticism that you have.
this is where the bias of
Hmm.
the sort of
Yeah.
tech CEO based
Yeah.
in sort of Northern California comes in,
Yeah.
because California is conventionally a very
Yeah.
liberal sort of
Exactly.
area, and you have tech CEOs there who kind of push these liberal messages.
Hmm.
So a lot of the criticism that they face is, for example, related to issues like the
Hmm.
suspension of Donald Trump's Twitter account.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there were people on the left who were equally irresponsible in some
Hmm.
statements, but their Twitter accounts were operating freely,
Hmm.
which uh, uh, even strengthened people like Elon Musk's resolve to take over Twitter and turn it into sort of his version, which is X now.
But
And
that's the
obviously,
problem, Raj, because now after taking over Twitter, there was some guy on YouTube who made an entire list of things which Elon Musk posted on his X account, which were absolutely false or fabricated.
right,
And he
yeah,
thought that that was right. So now, if there is some conservative white man who is a huge Elon Musk supporter, and if he reads something like that, he will, believe it. And
yeah,
again,
absolutely.
that can cause violence.
Yeah, so I mean, that's, I keep
Mhm.
circling back to, right,
Yeah.
a responsible free
Hmm.
speech, yet having some kind of oversight. But
Hmm. Absolutely.
how do you do this within the local limitations of a nation state, where data is stored, where attempts to store data local, where
Hmm.
law enforcement has its own limitations, where the extent of law and your parliament and your judiciary has a limitation. So trying to regulate tech which crosses, it goes beyond borders and goes beyond continents in seconds, that's the regulatory framework is always only making incremental efforts to catch up.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, where the challenge lies. One
Absolutely.
more thing that I kind of want to add to this is that even in OTT regulation in India, we have only been able to do very basic amounts of regulation, in the sense that the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting made some attempts, because I think there were initial concerns that a lot of the content on OTT platforms was quote unquote perverted, and you needed a certain level of censorship that you have even in cinema halls.
Hmm.
So the only basic amounts of regulation that we've been able to do is that you are required to display a UA or a 18 plus or an adult, that kind of certification right now. And then, like I said, there is a certain amount of self regulatory kind of approach that is required. And obviously a requirement for a
Hmm.
grievance slash liaison officer, who the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting can sort of get in touch with if an
Hmm.
OTT platform is seen to be spreading
Hmm.
irresponsible or content which is seen as violative of the law or social norms or those
Absolutely.
kinds of things. So I think a lot of what OTT regulations first wave saw were parental controls that were coming
Hmm.
in through regulatory oversight.
Absolutely.
I think throughout this discussion, even to myself, I sound a little uninformed. But I think both Jay and I can be forgiven for that, because that is exactly where the tech policy regulatory framework is right now.
Hmm.
Not just in India, across the world. There are no certain machinery. or there are no certain policy prescriptions that you can follow
Mm-hmm.
that can be used to effectively regulate data fiduciaries yet allow them to operate freely. Because I think most of us, the who kind of identify as balanced, will want a certain level of freedom of speech to be practiced by these organizations, but you also want to hold them accountable when they get into the misinformation spreading and harboring bad types of pornography and that kind of
Of
content on their
course, of course.
platforms. Anyway, that's the
Nay,
end of my thoughts on
I
this.
totally agree with you. And what we're at a very interesting stage in human existence, and as artificial intelligence gets better and more advanced, I feel there would be a time where certain individuals who are running the technological innovation space, the space of technological innovation, and dominating that through their companies. I think those people, if they don't make any major gains in artificial intelligence, I think those companies uh, would get redundant, and their influence would eventually reduce, because we've seen that with a lot of gadgets and a lot of companies. Like, there was this one time when everyone thought that Nokia is like unbeatable, and like, nothing can like, come close to Nokia, and now it's gone back to like, just making heavy duty cameras, and like, gone to like providing 5G cellular technologies, and like, their smartphones are not very good because they weren't willing to innovate at the in 2007 when iPhone was released. Then BlackBerry also had its time, and it thought that like, the corporates would never shift to an iPhone. But clearly, once the iPhone started like, becoming so accessible, the corporates eventually shifted to iPhone, and BlackBerry became redundant. So that's my main argument. Ki after a while, there has to be some understanding that artificial intelligence is the way to go, and accordingly the big tech has to adapt itself, and the companies which will not adapt themselves to the new challenges, they will get redundant. And accordingly, the databases that these companies have created and the data that they have accumulated, specifically from massive countries like India and China. China has data localization, if I'm not wrong, does
I
it?
believe so,
Yeah.
yes.
So, but I'm pretty sure the Americans, like these American companies, would have some data of the Chinese as well,
I'm
stored
sure. I
at
mean,
servers. Like some, there has to be.
yeah.
There is no way that they don't.
I mean, again, this is
Hmm.
beyond our
Of
understanding,
course,
but
it is. It is.
so
So, but again, India ka to hai na, and given that, what would artificial intelligence role be in managing that data, in controlling that data, and in dispensing that data according to the wishes of different government agencies and institutes, would be a key deciding factor.
I mean, I agree with
Hmm.
that. I do think that you, it's a again, it's a double-edged sword. You use
Hmm.
that term a lot.
Thrice.
Yeah, but I think that AI platforms need to be regulated, but I also think AI tools can be used
These
in
two regulation,
regulation
exactly.
also. So I think that, for example, AI can do an excellent job of identifying red flags. So, for example, if you have one word that you think that should alarm the law enforcement agencies,
Haha.
then I think AI tools can do a very good job of
Yeah.
picking up on that data
Hmm.
and forwarding like valuable data to law enforcement agencies. Having said that, like we've seen that with language learning platforms and generative AI as well, that they are very quickly known to produce falsified information on their own, and that's why they disclaim on the platforms themselves. Like I use ChatGPT a lot, and the first thing you read on it is it's very likely to make mistakes also.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So that disclaimer is also important. So you need to know that it can also, if not regulated properly, spread some misinformation,
Hmm.
but it can also be a very good tool in alerting, alarming, and finding, for the lack of a better
Of
word,
course, of course.
finding red flags,
Yeah.
and finding things that should alarm
Hmm.
governments and law enforcement. And that's, I think, my view.
Okay, so we can now shift to the other topic that we want to discuss today. Uh, it's going to be a jump from Pavel Durov's arrest to the October 7th attacks that were conducted by
I'm not
Hamas.
even going to say this is going to be a jump,
It's not
because
actually.
it's even the way the conflict in West Asia has unfolded. It has so much to do with social media.
Yeah,
The
social media,
October 7th
artificial
attacks,
intelligence as
yes,
well,
the October 7th attacks were
monitoring.
broadcast almost minute to minute across the world.
Yeah,
Like everybody, like we were getting updates here in Delhi as quickly as somebody was
yeah,
getting them in Tel Aviv or Washington.
yeah, and the videos that were coming out were absolutely horrifying.
Yeah. But
Bro, I
so, you
think.
know,
Yeah,
social media and platform governance definitely
yeah,
plays a role in modern warfare also. And
absolutely.
as a result, we can pivot to
Yeah.
the
I
first
think
year
the most
anniversary.
shocking thing that I read on social media was there was some discussion that was happening, and like, of course, those sides were pro-Palestinian sides, and this is when Hamas had, like, totally obliterated, like, the entire defense establishment of southern Israel, and they had attacked the music festival, and they were on a killing spree. And there's this one video that came out where a woman called Shani Luke was lying half naked on a pickup truck, and her dead body was being spat on and, like, beaten and all of that. And then obviously it was driven inside Gaza. And instead of discussing the horrific nature of that particular action, people were discussing whether she was wearing a bikini or not. Like, that is the level of discussion. Because, like, the pro-Palestinian side who was talking on Twitter, she was trying to say that no, she wasn't bare. Her clothes weren't torn off. She was just wearing a bikini. So I'm like, bhai, that is not the point. It's a woman was killed, and she was clearly, like, some parts of her clothing were torn off. So you cannot, like, justify that by any means just because you have certain political biases. But again, like, sorry, I
Yeah,
got
I mean, yeah,
sorry
but
I got wait,
how do you flag such conversations,
exactly.
and how do
How do
you
you exactly?
alert social media platforms
Yeah,
that this is where this conversation is getting on a route where it's
yeah.
justifying
And
violence
apparently this woman
almost?
was a Times of India
So,
journalist for a very long
Times of
time.
India.
Times of India or India Today, some
Okay.
journalist, but she left. I'm not
And
gonna
the
take her
the
name.
woman who had passed, or the woman
The
who
woman
wrote?
who commented
Okay,
this, and, like,
okay.
and we again, like, very blatant opponent of the present government, has very very strong opinions about women's rights. But such comments were, like, just atrocious. Anyway, uh so this particular incident really shook me, and I was like, how can you ensure that people at least you know
Flag those conversations
flag
and
those comments? Because I think the lot of statements that were made by Kangana Ranaut's sister, again, preposterous, horrible statements that she made, those were flagged immediately. And I
yeah.
think for certain individuals who have a reasonable following on social media, such flagging needs to be done, specifically when it comes to making comments about someone who's passed or someone who's dead, and at times of, like, a lot. Because what happens in cases of war, there is informational obfuscation, there's a lot of confusion, and the truth mo- usually gets lost in the fog of
Yeah.
war.
To the
Yeah,
discredit of platforms
yeah.
like Twitter and Telegram and even YouTube for that matter, to a small extent, but to the discredit of some platforms like
Mhm.
this, there is very little you can do to prevent posting of videos related
Mhm.
to killing and violence. And all that the platform does is makes you like
Yes,
go through that disclaimer that okay, this may have content that may be disturbing for a few people. But my view is that a lot of it should be sort of identified, flagged, and be prevented from posting. I think regardless of ideology, people generally don't like to see people get violently murdered on social media
but it
platforms.
always comes up. It
And
always
it
comes up.
always comes up, and this is to the
Yeah.
great discredit of platforms that outwardly defend strong encryptions and end-to-end encryptions. That how do you prevent content which has, again, I keep coming back to things like extreme deviant kind of pornography,
Mhm.
or even violent videos of people being killed or beheaded.
Mhm.
You start flirting with the demographic of people, those which are spreading this kind of information also.
Yeah, but
So
so that's Vice actually did a whole small documentary of sorts where they were interviewing people from different social media platforms. One person from probably Meta, which was Facebook around that time. And that person's responsibility was to flag data and videos and content which was extremely violent, and his tone was so disturbed because he was talking about the kind of videos that he came across that were constantly being uploaded were so graphic in nature that just after a while he just did not understand what, how much cruelty humans can
yeah,
impose
I
on
also
each other.
think a very strong
Hmm.
case for letting AI do the flagging
Exactly.
part of this is that the human toll of somebody having to go through these videos to flag them and moderate this content is very high. So
Absolutely.
if you have AI flag like violent videos or pornographic videos, then at the very least
Mhm.
AI doesn't have a mental health
Nee, I
yet.
think
So
but I
so
think
at
they
the
they
very least
have
they can do a
deployed
good
AI
job of
models around it. I think they have.
must be a very new
Okay.
development, and I think must be a work in progress
No, yeah,
because
of
AI
course,
is
still
always
work in
developing, right?
progress.
So
Absolutely.
um,
Yeah, so October 7th attacks are also very important with from the angle of big tech and the narratives that are driven in social media platforms is because immediately after the attacks there's this news that went around which said that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies, which wasn't true. And again this was used for good 24 hours by the Israeli media to fan up more anger and more hate against the Palestinians. And in fact it went to the the US president as well, where he talked about beheading babies, even though it wasn't true. There were instances of beheadings, but babies weren't beheaded. Soldiers of the IDF were, and that is corroborated through a BBC video where I saw where a father of an Israeli soldier was looking for his son's head for 5 days after the massacre. So the beheadings did happen in the kibbutz, but not of babies that can be confirmed. A 14-year-old was also killed in the attacks, yes, but 40 babies were not beheaded. But again, see the irresponsible reporting, and that was again used as a justification for the eventual onslaught that happened on Gaza. Now, coming back to the first point that I really want to talk about is that on those borders, also the IDF had deployed automatic weapons which were remotely controlled, and a lot of systems over there were monitored through artificial intelligence as well.
yeah,
A lot of censoring, and the wall that was built around Gaza was dubbed as impenetrable. There was so much hullabaloo around it, and essentially, what took Hamas was just a piece of paper to totally dismantle the whole idea of the wall being a good barrier against the eventual onslaught,
yeah.
because they stopped relying on phones, telephonic communication. Nothing happened, and the whole intelligence that they gathered was through the workers who were going inside Israel every day. 20,000 workers from the Gaza Strip were going inside and outside Israel to work. And for the last 2 3 years, the relations between the Israeli government and the Gaza Strip were good. In fact, most of the tension was at the West Bank, so the Israeli government wasn't expecting any attack from the Gaza Strip. So in that process, Hamas actually uh, took advantage of Israeli negligence, and through old techniques, old styles of intelligence collection, they were able to totally dismantle such a massive project. And
And I think a lot of
hmm,
these AI tools and machines
yeah,
that Israel relied on so heavily
yeah,
for its fencing and defense were, I think, designed only for a limited attack,
yeah,
that you
exactly.
could perhaps counter 2 3
That's
missiles.
what a lot of
You could
people from the
you
Israeli
could
side were
yeah,
saying.
you could prevent
Yeah,
5 6
7, 8 people,
7 8
10
people
people.
from entering. You
Yeah,
could alert maybe a small company of the
yeah.
IDF. But this attack was so overwhelming and the
To
planning was so,
1,500 people just
yeah.
coming in.
And I think that's
Absolute
another
massacre.
reason why these sort of formidable Israeli defense systems failed that day in October 7th.
Yeah, I think the
And
whole propaganda also around IDF being like this amazing, amazing institution, like, very good at intelligence, also took a massive beating, and their credibility really reduced.
Yeah.
Because I feel, I think we were extremely hard on our intelligence services. I remember in 2008 when the Mumbai attacks were happening, the Israeli government was extremely patronizing against the Indian forces response. But I feel, after October 7th, I think the Israeli government should also do a lot of retrospection, because not only you failed your citizens, but the amount of people you let Hamas take as hostages, insane, shouldn't have happened. And the way you have responded with such brute force, not caring about your own hostages, also says a lot about how much you really care
Yeah,
about your
absolutely.
hostages.
I mean, the cries for a very warranted cries,
Absolutely.
for a more humanitarian pause should have been adhered to, especially because the IDF wasn't doing a good job of protecting its hostages after a point
Yeah.
anyway. It was just a merciless bombing campaign after a point that possibly maybe even led to who knows the deaths of their own
Yes, yes.
hostages. You
70
when you're
hostages are already dead inside the Gaza
Yeah,
Strip.
so when you're mercilessly bombing
Hmm.
an entire area, you're clearly not doing a targeted hostage rescue
Yeah.
operation, which was the US's attempt. That the US was very strongly pushing Israel to do a very targeted strike, maybe at the Hamas, to take humanitarian pauses. But Netanyahu, being Netanyahu, has sort of remained defiant throughout. And even I think supporters of Israel or people who are critical of Hamas and Iran will after a point just sort of look back and say thoda zyada ho gaya hai.
भाई सही में
It's just
यार
been pushed a lot. So
बहुत ज्यादा हो गया.
yeah.
But yeah, वही ना, I just feel that the attack on the October 7th, I, nothing can justify that.
No, it was a trigger for sure,
Yeah,
but
nothing can justify the attack.
but
I get it,
I
like
mean,
segregation, the Nakba. I get the perspective of Hamas. I totally get the perspective of Palestinians. I get it that they've been living in an apartheid state for the longest time. But in that context, I feel Nelson Mandela was also staying in an apartheid state. And
yeah,
after a while, he totally got rid of his
yeah,
terrorist activities, and his actions were, and were not focused on violence.
yeah,
And the fact that you went and killed 1,500 people of a population which is already less in number as compared to the Arabs and the Muslims in the world, and of a population which has already faced something like the Holocaust. And of course, the Arabs had nothing to do with it. And I totally agree that Israel is a colonial project. You just gave them a reason for another, another another bombing campaign, another devastating campaign where your people end up suffering the most.
yeah. I mean, there is nobody effectively, like, I'm not even going to try because I personally think that
Mhm.
we overstate an
Yeah.
individual voice.
Yeah.
Contested take, I don't really think that my
Mhm.
voice matters that much. I don't think your voice matters that much either, to
Mhm.
our dear viewers, with all due respect. So
Mhm.
all I think is that, uh, see, sovereign institutions will do what they want.
Mhm.
The US ensures an endless supply of arms, ammunitions, and machinery to Israel. The Israelis exploit it, even to the dissatisfaction of the Americans. Sometimes
Yes.
the Joe Biden administration tried many times to restrain Israel. Many times, officials close to the Joe Biden administration went on record to say it,
Mhm.
actually. So. There was going to be a bombing campaign
Yeah.
against Hamas, which was going to be merciless. Almost you could have prescribed it the day October 7th happened.
Yeah.
So there is no moral limitation I, as a small, policy uh, enthusiast, for the lack of a better word, can do that that will make any sense. So prescribing moral limitations on either the IDF or Hamas is not going to work. These are organizations which are funded by big international powers. There's a
Yeah.
lot more at play. And I think that there's very reason that maybe Hamas fighters, with the strength of the state of Iran,
Mhm.
will see anything beyond an infidel in an Israeli. They
Mhm.
won't be able to see an Israeli Jewish person as a human being. And on the contrary, the angered, the disappointed IDF person who's looking at October 7th as a day
Mhm.
of, like, their own 9/11, for the lack of a better analogy.
Hmm.
There's very little that can humanize the Gaza Strip for them.
Of
So
course.
I honestly think that I I think the time has come, contested take again, to ensure a ceasefire by force, maybe. Maybe like
Like what
why
they did in
can't,
Yugoslavia.
yeah, like why can't you have maybe a UN peacekeeping operation? It's the real time that our international institutions and the UN prove their mettle.
Hmm.
They've been very uninvolved in peace for
Of
the last
course.
2-3 years. We've seen what's going on in Russia and
Hmm.
Ukraine. We're seeing what's going on in West Asia. So it's either that or this is going to continue. People are
Hmm.
going to continue dying, and we are none of us are going to be able to do much about it.
Absolutely.
That's my
So
take. Yeah,
yeah, I totally agree. And I think now we can do. Should we end the episode or should we talk about?
I'm done.
You're
If you
done.
have more to talk about, I'm available.
Yeah, I think we should end the episode.
All right.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you for joining in.
Thank you for joining us, guys. We apologize for such a big delay, but we had our limitations. And what we'll do is that next time when I go for a tour or a trip, we'll record like 2 episodes so that we have another episode lined up coming in the next
No, but I
week.
think we fixed our Wi-Fi also,
Yeah, we fixed our
so
Wi-Fi
we'll
as
be
well.
able to do it.
Online as well.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
problem we had when we couldn't upload online was because our Wi-Fi had conked off that very day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, thank you for
Thank you so
joining.
much. Bye. Love you.